June 22nd, 1476. The hills outside Morat, Switzerland. In a thunderstorm that turns earth to mud, a lone Burgundian lookout sees movement in the tree line, then realizes the shadows are not shadows at all. They are Swiss pikemen, marching in silence, advancing in perfect formation toward 20,000 Burgundian soldiers who have no idea they are seconds from annihilation. When the storm breaks, it reveals a wall of steel rushing downhill. In less than 1 hour, an entire army will cease to exist. There are moments in history when a man's ambition becomes so vast, so intoxicating, that he cannot see the abyss opening before him. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, stood in his command tent on a spring morning in 1476 and believed he was building an empire that would rival Rome itself. He was 43 years old. He had inherited the richest lands in Europe, a sprawling patchwork of territories stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, crowned with the jewel cities of Flanders, humming with wealth from wool and wine and banking. But wealth was not enough. Charles wanted something men had whispered about for centuries: a kingdom, a crown, a name that would echo through time like Caesar or Charlemagne. The Swiss Confederation stood in his way, a loose alliance of mountain cantons, fiercely independent, stubbornly republican, armed with pikes and pride. They had humiliated him once already at Grandson, where his army had broken and fled, leaving behind treasure worth a king's ransom. Charles told himself it was a fluke, bad ground, bad luck, bad subordinates, not his fault. Now, in June of 1476, he marched 20,000 men toward the town of Morat, Merton to the Germans, a small fortified city on the edge of a lake. Take Morat, crush the Swiss reinforcements when they arrived, and the Confederation would splinter like glass. He would dictate terms. He would carve new borders. He would be remembered forever. What Charles did not understand, what he refused to understand, was that he was not fighting an army. He was fighting a culture. The Swiss did not wage war for glory or conquest. They fought for survival, for their valleys, for their right to govern themselves without bowing to dukes or kings or bishops. And when threatened, they did not merely fight. They came together like a single clenched fist. Charles set up his siege lines around Morat with clockwork precision. Artillery positioned, trenches dug, supply lines secured. He bombarded the walls day after day, sending cannonballs crashing into stone, sending assault waves forward with scaling ladders. The defenders held, barely. But Charles was patient. He had time. He had numbers. He had the best artillery train in Europe. Inside his tent, maps spread across tables. He traced lines with his finger. Here the Swiss would march from Bern. Here they would meet his entrenched positions. Here they would die. His commanders nodded. His astrologers assured him the stars were favorable. His confidence became contagious, spreading through the camp like fever. But confidence in war is a blade with two edges. It sharpens resolve. It also blinds. By mid-June, the Burgundian camp had settled into a strange rhythm. Men played dice, cooked meals, told jokes. The siege became routine. Soldiers stopped wearing full armor. Horses grazed unsaddled. Sentries relaxed their watch. Why worry? The Swiss were days away, maybe longer, and when they came, they would march straight into prepared positions, into artillery fields, into crossfire that would shred their ranks before they reached striking distance. Charles the Bold sat in his tent and waited for his empire to begin. He did not know that 1,200 men were already moving through the forests. He did not know that the rain was coming. He did not know that in 72 hours, his name would mean something very different to history. The Duke smiled. Morat would fall. The Swiss would kneel. And Europe would remember him forever. On that last point, at least, he would be proven right. To understand what happened at Morat, you need to understand what the Swiss Confederation was, and more importantly, what it was not. It was not a kingdom. It was not an empire. It was a collection of mountain valleys bound together by a single shared conviction. No one would ever rule them again. For 2 centuries, the Swiss had been freeing themselves piece by piece from the Habsburgs, from feudal lords, from anyone who tried to collect taxes, or conscript sons, or dictate laws from distant thrones. They had no king, no standing army, no professional officer class. What they had instead was something far more dangerous. Every man a soldier, every soldier a citizen, every citizen willing to die rather than submit. The Swiss military system was built on militia service, farmers, craftsmen, merchants. When the horn sounded, they left their fields and workshops, grabbed their pikes and halberds, and marched. But they were not a peasant rabble. They trained constantly, drilled in formation, practiced maneuvers in village squares and mountain passes. Their weapon, the pike, a wooden shaft tipped with steel, stretching 18 feet long, required coordination, discipline, and absolute trust in the men beside you. In Swiss hands, the pike became more than a weapon. It became a philosophy. Rows of men standing shoulder to shoulder, pikes bristling forward like the quills of some enormous beast, moving in lockstep, unstoppable. Cavalry could not break them. Infantry could not penetrate them. Artillery could thin their ranks, but the ranks closed again, stepping over their own dead without hesitation. Other armies fought for pay, for loot, for lords who would abandon them the moment the battle turned. The Swiss fought for each other, for their cantons, for the knowledge that if they broke and ran, their families would be the ones to suffer. That bond created something terrifying on the battlefield. Men who would not retreat, men who would march into cannon fire and keep coming, men who sang hymns as they killed you. By 1476, the Swiss reputation had spread across Europe like a ghost story. Mercenary captains spoke their name with grudging respect. Knights crossed themselves at the thought of facing them. Kings hired Swiss guards to protect their palaces because no one else could be trusted so completely. The Swiss did not break. They did not surrender. They did not negotiate once the horn sounded. Charles the Bold knew all of this. He had fought them before. He had lost to them before. But he told himself that grandson was an aberration. He had better ground now, better preparation, more men, more guns, and the Swiss surely could be broken like any other army if you just hit them hard enough. What Charles did not grasp, what so many professional soldiers never grasped, was that the Swiss were not playing the same game. They were not trying to maneuver for advantage or preserve their forces or win tactical victories. They were trying to destroy you, completely, utterly, to make an example so terrible that no one would dare threaten their valleys again. In mid-June, word reached Bern. Morat was under siege. The garrison was holding, but barely. Burgundian cannons were pounding the walls to rubble. Time was running out. The cantons sent messengers racing through the mountains. Lucerne, Zurich, Schwyz, Uri. Every town and valley emptied its able-bodied men. They grabbed weapons passed down through generations, kissed their wives and children, and began the march. 1,200 men against 20,000. The numbers did not matter. The numbers never mattered. What mattered was getting there before Morat fell. What mattered was showing Charles the Bold what happened when you cornered the Swiss. They marched through rain, through mud, through mountain passes where the fog clung thick as wool. They sang as they walked. Battle hymns, old songs about freedom and blood and never kneeling. And with every step, they grew more certain of what was coming. Not victory, not survival, just the fight itself, the chance to stand and face the enemy and make them pay for every inch of ground. The Swiss were coming, and they would not stop. Inside the walls of Morat, time had collapsed into a single endless moment of noise and terror, and stubborn, desperate hope. The garrison numbered fewer than 2,000 men. Militia, town guards, a handful of professional soldiers. They had been holding the walls for 10 days, and every single one of those days felt like a year. The Burgundian bombardment began at dawn and did not stop until dusk. Cannonballs crashed into stone, walls cracked, towers crumbled, dust hung in the air so thick you could taste it, gritty and bitter, coating your throat. The defenders patched breaches, with rubble and timber and prayer. They hauled stones back into place. They threw boiling water and quicklime at assault parties scrambling up ladders. They fought with crossbows and pikes and rocks and desperation. At night, the bombardment stopped, but the fear did not. Men slept in their armor, weapons in hand, waiting for the next wave. Civilians huddled in cellars and churches, listening to the thunder of cannon fire, wondering if the next impact would bring the roof down on their heads. Food was rationed, water carefully measured. Every barrel of powder counted like gold. The garrison commander, Adrian von Bubenberg, was a knight from Bern, grey-haired and granite-faced, the kind of man who did not waste words on speeches or morale-building rhetoric. He simply showed up wherever the fighting was worst, pike in hand, and fought alongside his men. When a breach opened in the eastern wall, he was there, leading the counter-attack. When an assault tower rolled forward and grappling hooks caught the battlements, he was there, cutting ropes and pushing ladders back into the mass of bodies below. His presence steadied the garrison, but everyone knew the math. They were outnumbered 10-1. Ammunition was running low. The walls were crumbling faster than they could be repaired. And reinforcements, the Swiss army promised from Bern, had not arrived. Where were they? Days had passed since the first messengers rode out. Maybe the cantons had refused to send help. Maybe political squabbling had delayed the muster. Maybe the Swiss army was marching slowly, cautiously, waiting for the perfect moment that would never come. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept von Bubenberg awake at night, maybe they were not coming at all. On the morning of June 21st, a Burgundian herald approached under a white flag and shouted terms of surrender. The garrison could leave with honor, no reprisals, no executions, just open the gates, lay down your weapons, and walk away. It was a generous offer by the standards of siege warfare. Morat was doomed. Everyone knew it. Why die for nothing? Von Bubenberg sent the herald back with a single word: no. That afternoon, the Burgundians launched their most determined assault yet. Siege towers, ladders, sappers trying to tunnel under the walls, wave after wave of men in full armor, climbing over their own dead to reach the battlements. The defenders held, but barely. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Wounded soldiers dragged themselves back into the line because there was no one to replace them. The walls were red with blood. The air stank of smoke and shit and death. And then, as the sun began to set, someone saw it. A thin trail of smoke rising from the western tower. A signal rocket arcing into the sky, trailing sparks. The prearranged code. The message they had been waiting for, praying for, hoping against hope, would come before it was too late. Reinforcements were near. The garrison erupted in cheers, exhausted voices cracking with relief and defiance. Men embraced, wept, crossed themselves. The Swiss were coming. They just had to hold one more night, one more day, just a little longer. Inside the Burgundian camp, sentries saw the rocket and shrugged. So the Swiss had finally arrived. Let them come. Let them march straight into prepared defences. Let them see what 20,000 professional soldiers looked like. Charles the Bold heard the news and smiled. Perfect. He would crush them in the open field, and Morat would surrender by week's end. Everything was going according to plan. Neither side knew yet that the storm was coming, that the rain would turn the ground to soup, that the Swiss were not marching on the road, but moving through the forests, that the battle would not happen in the open field at all. Neither side knew that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. The defenders of Morat slept fitfully that night, weapons in hand, listening to the distant sound of Burgundian laughter drifting over the walls. The Swiss Confederation did not make decisions quickly. It could not. There was no king to give orders, no centralized command structure to mobilize armies with a stroke of a pen. Every canton was sovereign. Every town council had to debate. Every village had to vote. This was the price of freedom. Consensus took time. When the call went out that Morat was besieged, the response was immediate. But the assembly was not. Messengers raced from Bern to Zurich, from Lucerne to Schwyz, from Uri to the smaller mountain valleys where villages clung to cliffsides like barnacles. Each canton had to muster its militia. Each town had to decide how many men to send. Farmers had to finish planting. Merchants had to secure their shops. Families had to say goodbye, knowing they might never see their sons and fathers again. Days passed. Then, a week. Inside Morat, the defenders held on by sheer willpower. Outside, Charles the Bold's siege lines tightened like a noose. And across the mountains, the Swiss army slowly, agonizingly, came together. By June 18th, the main force had finally assembled near Bern. 1,200 men. It was not a large army by the standards of the day. Charles commanded 20,000, but the Swiss did not measure strength in numbers alone. They measured it in discipline, in the quality of their pikes, in the willingness of each man to die for the man beside him. The commanders gathered in a farmhouse outside Bern to plan the march. Nikolaus von Scharnachtal, a veteran captain with scars earned in a dozen battles. Petermann von Wabern, younger but respected for his tactical mind. Hans Waldmann, ruthless and brilliant. And others, representatives from each canton, each carrying the weight of their people's expectations. The debate was short. There was only one question that mattered. How fast could they reach Morat before the city fell? They would march through the night, through the forests, avoiding main roads where Burgundian scouts might spot them. They would trust the terrain, the paths they knew from childhood, the shortcuts through valleys and over ridges. They would move silently, disciplined, in columns that could shift to battle formation in minutes. And they would arrive at dawn, before Charles expected them, before his army was fully awake. It was a gamble, a forced march through difficult terrain. If they stumbled into an ambush, if they lost cohesion in the dark, if scouts spotted them and Charles repositioned his forces, the Swiss would march straight into a slaughter. But doing nothing meant Morat would fall. Doing nothing meant the Confederation would fracture, so they would march. On the evening of June 21st, as the signal rocket rose from Morat's walls, the Swiss army began moving. 1,200 men, pikes on shoulders, marching in near silence. The forests swallowed them. The darkness hid them. And above, the first drops of rain began to fall. Inside the Burgundian camp, confidence had curdled into complacency. The siege had dragged on for days. The Swiss were reportedly assembling, but no one expected them to arrive soon. Certainly not at night. Certainly not in this weather. The rain fell harder, turning paths to mud, drenching tents, soaking firewood. Sentries huddled under cloaks. Artillery crews covered their powder stores and prayed the barrels stayed dry. Soldiers grumbled and played dice and waited for morning. Charles the Bold remained in his tent, studying maps by candlelight. His commanders assured him the defences were ready. The Swiss would march into killing fields. Victory was inevitable. Charles nodded, satisfied. He had learned from grandson. This time, there would be no mistakes. But outside, in the rain-soaked darkness, something was moving through the trees. A sound like distant thunder, but rhythmic, regular. The tramp of boots in mud, the creak of armor, the whisper of pikes brushing against branches. The Swiss were not marching on the road. They were not approaching from the expected direction. They were coming through the forest, guided by men who knew every trail and stream, every hidden path. Burgundian sentries heard nothing. The rain drowned out sound. Visibility dropped to 20 paces. And in the camp, most soldiers had stopped wearing full armor. Why bother? The Swiss were still far away, probably waiting for morning, probably as miserable in this rain as everyone else. As midnight passed, the Swiss halted in the forest above the Burgundian camp. They rested briefly, whispered prayers, checked weapons, adjusted formation. The rain hammered down, relentless, cold, but the Swiss were mountain men. Rain did not stop them. Rain did not slow them. Rain made them invisible. At dawn they would strike, not from the direction Charles expected, not after his army had breakfasted and formed ranks. They would hit the camp itself, hard and fast, before the Burgundians could react. It was audacious. It was insane. It was the only chance Morat had. In the darkness, a Burgundian lookout heard something. A sound carried on the wind, not thunder, something else, something wrong. He squinted into the rain, seeing nothing. Probably just the storm, he told himself. Probably nothing. He turned back toward the camp, shivering, and did not raise the alarm. Above him, in the trees, 1,200 men prepared to descend like an avalanche. The storm arrived like a biblical plague. Rain did not simply fall, it poured, it hammered, it turned the world into a grey, drowning blur where sky and earth merged into one endless sheet of water. Visibility collapsed to arm's length. Sounds became muffled, distorted, swallowed by the roar of water drumming on armour and earth and canvas. The night of June 21st became a night without stars, without moonlight, without any reference point except the mud beneath your feet and the man in front of you. For the Burgundians, the storm was a misery. Tents leaked. Fires sputtered and died. Powder stores had to be covered and recovered as water seeped through canvas. Men huddled together for warmth, cursing the weather, cursing the siege, cursing the Swiss for taking so long to arrive. Sentries abandoned their posts or stood under whatever shelter they could find, staring uselessly into sheets of rain. Armour was removed and stacked. Horses were left unsaddled. Weapons were leaned against tent poles. The camp settled into a cold, wet, miserable night of waiting for dawn. For the Swiss, the storm was a gift from God. It hid their approach. It silenced their movements. It turned their forced march through the forests into a ghostly procession, invisible and unstoppable. They moved in tight columns, each man gripping the shoulder strap of the man ahead, navigating by instinct and intimate knowledge of the terrain. These were mountain men. They had trained in worse weather. They had marched through blizzards and fog and darkness. Rain was nothing. Rain was cover. The Swiss commanders understood immediately what the storm meant. They could attack at dawn with complete surprise. The Burgundians would be scattered, disorganized, unprepared. Their artillery would be useless, powder-soaked, visibility zero. Their cavalry would struggle in the mud. Their infantry would be scrambling to form ranks while the Swiss pike columns crashed into them like iron fists. But there was risk, too. The Swiss force was small, 1,200 men. If they faltered, if the charge broke, if the Burgundians rallied quickly, the Swiss would be slaughtered in the open. Everything depended on momentum, on hitting so hard and so fast that the enemy never had time to think, only to run. Around 3 a.m, the Swiss army halted in the forest overlooking the Burgundian camp. They were close now, so close they could hear the camp, muffled voices, the clatter of equipment, horses nickering. The rain continued its relentless drumming. The commanders moved through the ranks, whispering final instructions. Check your pike. Stay in formation. When the horns sound, do not stop. Do not slow. Drive forward until the enemy breaks, or you are dead. The men knelt in the mud and prayed. Not elaborate prayers, simple ones. God give me strength. God protect my brothers. God let us win this day. They crossed themselves. They gripped their pikes tighter. They waited. In the Burgundian camp, Charles the Bold slept fitfully in his tent, dreaming of victory. His commanders slept in their quarters, confident the defences would hold. The army slept scattered across a wide area, tents pitched haphazardly, no organised perimeter, no rapid response formations ready. Why worry? The Swiss were still far away, everyone said so. The scouts had reported nothing. Morning would come, the rain would stop, and then the real battle would begin on open ground where numbers mattered. But in the pre-dawn darkness, something changed. A Burgundian sentry, standing miserably under a dripping tarp, heard it first. A sound carried on the wind between gusts of rain, low, rhythmic, not thunder, not the storm, something else. He squinted into the darkness, seeing nothing. Probably his imagination, probably the weather playing tricks. But the sound grew louder, a distant rumble, growing closer, growing clearer. Then another sentry heard it, and another. Men looked at each other, uncertain, confused. What was that? The rumble became distinct. Footsteps, hundreds of them, thousands, marching in unison, and then cutting through the rain like a knife, a sound that froze blood. Swiss war horns, deep, primal, relentless. The attack had begun. They came out of the trees like something from a nightmare, not running, not charging yet, just walking. Emerging from the forest in perfect columns, pikes angled forward, moving through the rain with mechanical precision. The storm had hidden them until the last possible moment, and now they were simply there. Materializing from the grey dawn like death itself had taken solid form. The Burgundian sentries who saw them first did not immediately understand what they were seeing. Shapes in the mist, shadows moving with unnatural coordination. Then the horns sounded, deep, resonant blasts that cut through the rain and the thunder, the ancient war horns of the mountain cantons, tubas and cow horns that had echoed across alpine valleys for generations. The sound carried across the camp like a physical force, primitive and terrifying, announcing that something unstoppable was coming. Panic erupted instantly. Men stumbled from tents, half-dressed, scrambling for weapons that were not where they should be. Armor was scattered. Horses were unsaddled and panicked by the horns. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Where were the Swiss attacking from? How many? How had they gotten so close? The camp had been designed to face an attack from the road, from the east, where scouts had been watching. But the Swiss had not come from the east. They had come from the forest, from the northwest, descending from high ground directly into the heart of the Burgundian position. The Swiss vanguard kept walking. One step, another, another. The rhythm was hypnotic, relentless. Behind them, more columns emerged, and more. The forest seemed to be emptying itself of armed men, each one carrying an 18-foot pike, each one moving in perfect synchronization with his neighbors. They formed not a line, but a mass, dense and bristling, pikes protruding in every direction like the quills of some enormous creature. The Swiss called it the hedgehog. Everyone else called it death. Burgundian cavalry officers screamed for their men to mount. Horses were grabbed, saddles thrown on with shaking hands. Infantry captains tried to form defensive lines, but the men were scattered, disorganized, still waking from sleep. Artillery crews ran to their guns, then stopped in horror when they saw the powder, soaked through, useless, the rain having destroyed in one night what had taken weeks to transport and store. The great Burgundian artillery advantage, the technological edge that was supposed to shred the Swiss before they closed, was gone. The Swiss kept walking, closer now, close enough to see their faces through the rain, grim, focused, eyes locked forward. They did not shout battle cries. They did not taunt or threaten. They just walked, and that silence was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. A Burgundian knight, fully armored, managed to mount his horse and charge toward the approaching column. Brave, futile. The Swiss pike formation did not break stride. The knight hit the wall of steel and simply disappeared, horse and rider crashing into pikes that drove through armor like paper. The momentum of the charge turned instantly into a death trap. The horse screamed. The knight fell. The Swiss stepped over both and kept walking. The Burgundian camp was now fully awake and fully terrified. Men ran in every direction, some toward the Swiss, trying to form resistance, others away, already calculating that this battle was lost before it began. Officers grabbed whoever they could, trying to organize squads into coherent units. But organization required time, and time was the one thing the Burgundians did not have. The Swiss columns were 200 paces away now, then 100. The horns sounded again, a different note this time, a command. And in perfect unison, without breaking formation, the Swiss began to trot. Not a full run yet, just a faster pace. The pikes lowered slightly, angled for maximum impact. The sound of their boots in the mud became a drumbeat, rhythmic and inexorable. Burgundian soldiers who had managed to grab weapons formed desperate defensive clusters. Pikemen trying to set their own pikes against the Swiss charge. Crossbowmen fumbling with strings made slack by rain. Knights in half armor standing in mud that sucked at their boots. They looked at what was coming and understood instantly that they were going to die. The Swiss were 50 paces away. The trot became a run, and the iron wall crashed into the Burgundian camp like an avalanche made of steel. The Swiss pike formation was a work of brutal perfection, refined over generations of warfare into something that barely seemed human. It was geometry, made lethal. Mathematics applied to murder. Each pikeman stood shoulder to shoulder with his neighbours, so close you could not slip a hand between them. Each pike, 18 feet of ashwood tipped with sharpened steel, protruded forward at a precise angle, creating overlapping layers of death extending outward like the spines of a hedgehog. Front rank, pikes angled low, aimed at chest and gut height. Second rank, pikes extending over the shoulders of the first rank, angled slightly higher. Third rank, pikes reaching even farther, creating a forest of steel points that made the formation impossible to approach from any direction. And behind them, more ranks, ready to step forward the instant a man fell, closing gaps before the enemy could exploit them. No space, no weakness, just steel and discipline, and the absolute certainty that the man beside you would not break. They moved as one organism. When the front rank stepped, every rank stepped. When they turned together. When they accelerated, the entire mass accelerated in perfect synchronization. Years of drilling, of practicing in village squares and mountain meadows, had burned the movements into muscle memory so deep that men did not need to think. They simply moved, trusting the rhythm, trusting each other, trusting that the formation would hold no matter what hell they marched into. The Burgundian cavalry that managed to form up saw the pike wall approaching and understood immediately the terrible mathematics of their situation. A charging horse could reach 20 miles per hour. But a horse would not charge into a wall of steel points. Horses were not stupid. They would shy, turn, throw their riders rather than impale themselves. And even if you could force a horse forward, even if you somehow drove your mount into the pikes, you would die instantly, skewered before your sword could reach a single Swiss soldier. A squadron of Burgundian knights tried anyway. They were professionals, veterans, men who had fought in a dozen campaigns and never run from battle. They lowered lances, spurred their horses, and charged toward the Swiss left flank. The sound of hooves in mud was thunder. The sight of armoured cavalry bearing down should have broken lesser troops. The Swiss did not even slow. The collision was brief and catastrophic. Horses hit the pike points and screamed, rearing back, throwing riders. Lances shattered against the density of the formation. Knights fell into mud and were trampled by their own, panicked mounts. A few broke through the first rank by sheer momentum, only to be caught by the second rank, pikes driving through gaps in armour, through visors, through joints. The Swiss formation closed around the breach like water, and within seconds, the cavalry charge had simply ceased to exist. The Burgundians, who had managed to form infantry lines, fared no better. They set their own pikes and braced for impact, hoping to meet steel with steel. But Swiss pike formations did not fight statically. They moved, they pressed, they drove forward with the weight of men behind men, all pushing, all driving the pikes deeper. A Burgundian pikeman could hold his ground for seconds, maybe minutes, but the relentless pressure, the weight of bodies shoving from behind, would eventually force him back. And once you took a step backward, once the formation started to give way, the collapse was inevitable. The Swiss horns sounded again, a short, sharp blast, and the entire formation began to trot. Not a wild charge, not a disorganized rush, a controlled acceleration, every man keeping pace, the pikes lowering to optimal killing angle. The sound of their boots became a drumbeat. The rain hammered down, mud sprayed with each step, and the wall of steel closed the final distance to the Burgundian camp. Burgundian soldiers who stood their ground died where they stood. Pikes punched through armor, through bodies, through the men behind the first victims. Those who turned to run found Swiss halberdiers following behind the pike formation, finishing anyone who fell or fled. There was no quarter offered, no prisoners taken. The Swiss had not marched through a storm in the middle of the night to negotiate. They had come to destroy. And then, with 30 paces remaining, the Swiss began to run. A full sprint. The formation held. The rhythm held. 1,200 men moving as a single deadly mass, accelerating into the final impact. The sound they made was like nothing else in warfare. Boots and armor and steel and the guttural roar that finally escaped from throats that had been silent until this moment. The Burgundian line, such as it was, simply ceased to exist. The impact was not a clash of armies. It was an execution. The Swiss pike formation hit the Burgundian camp with the force of a landslide, and everything in its path collapsed instantly. Men who had been scrambling to form defensive positions were smashed aside, trampled, impaled before they could swing a weapon. Tents were flattened, supply wagons overturned, fires scattered. The careful organization of a siege camp, the product of weeks of engineering and logistics, disintegrated in seconds. Burgundian infantry clusters that tried to stand their ground were enveloped and destroyed. The Swiss did not stop to fight individual duels. They drove through, pikes stabbing forward, pulling back, stabbing again in mechanical rhythm. A Burgundian soldier might parry one pike, block a second, but there were always more. Always another steel point coming from an unexpected angle. The formation gave no individual Swiss soldier time to hesitate or doubt. You moved forward. You killed. The man behind you protected your back. That was all. The Burgundian artillery, positioned to dominate open ground, sat useless and abandoned. Crews had fled or died trying to defend guns that could not fire. The powder was soaked, the match cords extinguished. The beautiful bronze cannons, engraved with Burgundian heraldry, became monuments to futility. Swiss soldiers moved past them without pausing, focused only on the living enemy ahead. What made the collapse total, what turned retreat into rout, was the chain reaction of panic. When one Burgundian unit broke and ran, it crashed into units behind it. Fleeing soldiers collided with soldiers trying to form lines. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. Horsemen wheeled away from the Swiss advance, only to find their path blocked by their own infantry. Men threw down weapons and ran, and their flight infected everyone around them with the same desperate urge to escape. Charles the Bold, woken by the horns and the screaming, had emerged from his tent in partial armor and mounted his horse, riding desperately toward the fighting. He was Duke of Burgundy, the richest prince in Europe, commander of 20,000 men. He had planned this campaign for months, and now, in the grey dawn rain, he watched his army disintegrate before his eyes. He tried to rally troops, grabbed fleeing soldiers, shouted orders, threatened, pleaded. A few knights formed around him, creating a small armoured knot that held briefly against the tide. But the Swiss were everywhere now, their formations having penetrated so deep into the camp that there was no longer a front line, no clear direction to defend. It was chaos. Men fighting in small, desperate groups, bodies everywhere, mud red with blood, the rain washing it all downstream toward the lake. Charles saw a Burgundian banner, his own colours, the cross of Burgundy, still flying above a cluster of defending infantry. He spurred toward it, thinking if he could rally forces there, if he could create a defensive strongpoint, the army could reorganize. But before he reached it, he watched the Swiss pike wall crash into that position, and the banner fell, trampled into mud, and the men defending it simply disappeared into the mass of steel and fury. A knight grabbed Charles's bridle. "My lord, we have to go, now." Charles shook him off, looking for somewhere to make a stand, some miracle that would turn this catastrophe around. But there was nothing. The battle, if it could even be called a battle, was over. His army was running. The Swiss were killing anyone who could not run fast enough. And if he stayed, he would die here in the mud, surrounded by the corpse of his ambitions. Charles yanked his horse around and fled. It was the only choice left. Behind him, the Burgundian camp continued its collapse. Soldiers ran toward the lake, toward the woods, toward anywhere that was not here. The Swiss pursued with terrifying efficiency, not wildly, but in formation, methodical, cutting down stragglers, driving the rout forward like shepherds culling a diseased flock. The entire Burgundian line, 20,000 men, weeks of preparation, the finest equipment in Europe, had been shattered in less than 30 minutes. What remained was not an army. It was a mob of terrified survivors running for their lives through a storm, chased by men who would not stop until every enemy was dead or gone. The slaughter began in earnest once the Burgundian line broke. What had been a battle became a hunt. Swiss pike formations transitioned smoothly into pursuit mode, breaking into smaller units, spreading out to chase fleeing enemies across the slopes and valleys around Morat. The rain continued its relentless assault, turning every path into a river of mud, every slope into a treacherous slide, every depression into a drowning trap. Burgundian soldiers ran blindly, throwing away weapons and armor to move faster. Helmets discarded, swords dropped, shields abandoned. Men in full plate armor who could not shed the weight fast enough simply collapsed from exhaustion and were overtaken by Swiss halberdiers who finished them with brutal efficiency. No mercy was offered, no quarter asked or given. This was not a battle for ransoms or prisoners. This was extermination. The terrain became an accomplice to the massacre. Between the Burgundian camp and the lake stretched marshes and wetlands, soft ground that in the rain became a death trap. Fleeing soldiers plunged into what looked like solid earth and sank to their knees, their thighs, unable to pull themselves free. The weight of armor dragged them down. Panic made them thrash, which only drove them deeper. Hundreds drowned in inches of water, faces pressed into mud, lungs filling with liquid earth, while Swiss soldiers moved past them toward targets still capable of running. Others tried to swim the lake, desperate to put water between themselves and the pursuit. They stripped armor and plunged into the cold water, striking out for the far shore. Many made it halfway before exhaustion took them. Arms grew too heavy to lift. Legs stopped kicking. Bodies slipped beneath the surface without a sound, the rain hammering the water so hard that their disappearance left no trace. The Swiss pursued with mechanical determination. They did not chase out of rage or bloodlust. They chased because fleeing enemies who escaped would regroup and return. They chased because letting Burgundian soldiers survive meant those soldiers would threaten Swiss valleys again. They chased because that was the mission. Destroy this army so completely that no one would dare attack the Confederation for a generation. Swiss halberdiers, carrying their signature weapon, part axe, part spear, part hook, proved devastatingly effective in the pursuit. The halberd was designed for exactly this, catching fleeing men, pulling them down, finishing them before they could recover. A Burgundian soldier running at full sprint would feel the hook catch his ankle or shoulder, yanking him backward into the mud, and before he could rise, the axe blade would fall. Quick, efficient, no wasted motion. The storm masked the screams. Thunder rolled across the valley, drowning out human voices. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating scenes of carnage frozen in brief white glare before darkness returned. Burgundian banners, the proud colours of Flanders and Burgundy and Brabant, lay trampled in the mud, abandoned by fleeing soldiers who no longer cared about honour or heraldry or anything except survival. Some Burgundian units tried to form defensive positions during the retreat. Small groups of knights and infantry clustering together, backs to each other, hoping to hold long enough for others to escape. These islands of resistance lasted minutes at most. Swiss pike columns would surround them, compress them from all sides, and methodically kill everyone inside. No breaking ranks, no individual duels, just the formation closing like a fist until nothing inside still moved. Charles the Bold rode hard toward the south, surrounded by a handful of loyal knights. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of his army dying, screams, horns, the clash of steel, thunder, all blending into a symphony of disaster. He did not look back. There was nothing to see that would not break him completely. His grand army, his carefully assembled instrument of conquest, was gone. Just gone. 20,000 men reduced to scattered refugees in less than an hour. A few hundred Burgundians managed to reach the forest and escaped into the trees, protected by terrain the Swiss would not pursue into. A few hundred more found horses and rode hard enough to outpace the pursuit, but thousands, lay dead in the fields around Morat, or drowned in the marshes, or floated face down in the lake, their blood mixing with rainwater, washing downstream, staining the shore. By mid-morning, the Swiss slowed their pursuit, not from exhaustion, but from discipline. They had achieved their objective. The Burgundian army was destroyed. Chasing individual survivors into the countryside served no purpose. It was time to return, to secure the field, to count the cost. They walked back through the carnage they had created. Bodies everywhere, mud and blood and rain-soaked earth. And in the silence that followed the battle, broken only by thunder, the Swiss began to understand what they had done. Chapter 10. The battle lasted less than 1 hour. From the moment the Swiss emerged from the forest to the moment the last organized Burgundian resistance collapsed, barely 50 minutes had passed. 50 minutes to destroy an army 20 times larger. 50 minutes to end Burgundy's dream of empire. 50 minutes that would echo through European history for centuries. The field around Morat looked like the end of the world. Bodies lay piled where defensive positions had briefly held. Wounded men crawled through mud, calling for help that would not come. Horses, mortally injured, thrashed and screamed until Swiss soldiers put them down. Equipment was scattered everywhere. Swords, pikes, crossbows, armor, shields, banners, supply wagons overturned and looted by survivors. The rain continued falling, washing blood into streams that ran red toward the lake. Swiss soldiers walked through the aftermath in near silence. They had won, decisively, impossibly, but victory looked like this, like mountains of corpses, like the dying crying out in languages they did not understand, like the realization that they had just killed thousands of men in less time than it took to eat a meal. Some Swiss soldiers prayed, others simply stood, staring. A few wept. Many said nothing at all, faces blank with exhaustion and shock. On the walls of Morat, the defenders watched in disbelief. They had expected a battle. They had expected their reinforcements to arrive and fight outside the walls, while they supported from above. What they witnessed instead was something incomprehensible. A Burgundian army that stretched across the valley, simply ceasing to exist. Here one moment, gone the next. Replaced by Swiss soldiers, methodically securing the field. Adrian von Bubenberg, the garrison commander who had held the walls for 10 days against impossible odds, stood on the battlements and watched Swiss soldiers approach the gates. They were not marching in victory parade. They were walking quietly, weapons lowered, exhausted. When the gates opened and the first Swiss commander entered, von Bubenberg embraced him without words. What was there to say? Morat had been hours from falling. Now Morat was saved, and Burgundy was broken. The Swiss commanders began the grim accounting. How many Burgundians dead? Estimates ranged from 10,000 to 12,000. How many Swiss casualties? Fewer than 200 dead, perhaps 500 wounded. The numbers were so lopsided they seemed fictional. Battles did not end like this. Armies did not collapse this completely. But the evidence lay everywhere. Burgundian bodies outnumbering Swiss casualties by 50 to 1 or more. The bodies would remain on the field for days. Local villagers would later report that the stench was unbearable, that carrion birds darkened the sky for weeks. Burgundian soldiers who drowned in the lake would wash up on shore for months afterward. Some would never be recovered, their bones resting at the bottom of the lake alongside their ambitions and their armour. Charles the Bold had escaped with his life but little else. His treasury, left behind in the camp, was captured intact. Gold, jewels, plate, tapestries, documents, the accumulated wealth of the richest duchy in Europe. His artillery was captured. His supplies were taken. His reputation was destroyed. A duke who had lost one battle at Grandson might be forgiven. A duke who lost a second, even more catastrophic battle at Morat would never be trusted again. His allies would abandon him. His loans would be called. His empire would begin its collapse. For the Swiss Confederation, Morat became mythic before the bodies were even buried. 1,200 men had shattered 20,000. Farmers and craftsmen had destroyed the finest professional army in Europe. The mountains had defeated the plains. Discipline had crushed numbers. The story would be told in every Swiss valley, in every tavern, in every town square. It would become the founding myth of Swiss military prowess, the proof that their system worked, that their independence was earned in blood and could be defended against any odds. As sunset approached on June 22nd, the rain finally stopping, clouds beginning to break, the Swiss army began the march home. They left a garrison to support Morat's defenders and carried their wounded on improvised stretchers. They sang hymns as they walked, not triumphant war songs but somber prayers for the dead, theirs and the enemy's. Behind them, the field fell silent except for the cries of wounded men waiting for death. The Burgundian camp, once a city of tents and siege works, was now a graveyard. The banners of Burgundy lay trampled in mud that would never wash clean. And somewhere to the south, Charles the Bold rode toward an uncertain future, knowing that the world he had tried to build had died in less than an hour in the rain. The political earthquake was about to begin. Burgundy's collapse would reshape Europe. And the Swiss had just announced to every kingdom and duchy and principality on the continent, "We cannot be conquered. Leave us alone." Or this is what happens. Charles the Bold did not die at Morat, but something inside him did. The man who fled south through the rain that morning was not the same man who had besieged the city with supreme confidence days before. His army was shattered, his treasury was captured, his reputation, carefully built over years of military campaigns, was destroyed in less than an hour. And worse than any material loss was the psychological wound that would never heal. He had been humiliated by farmers. That was how the courts of Europe would tell the story. Not that Charles had been outmaneuvered by a brilliant tactical force, not that he had been defeated by superior discipline and terrain mastery. No, the narrative that spread through royal halls and noble estates was simpler and more devastating. The great Duke of Burgundy, with his modern artillery and professional soldiers, had been crushed by Swiss peasants. The mockery was immediate and merciless. Burgundian prestige collapsed overnight. Allies who had pledged support suddenly discovered pressing concerns elsewhere. Loans that had funded Charles's military ambitions were quietly called in. Mercenary captains who had been eager to serve the richest duke in Europe began negotiating with his enemies instead. The Burgundian state, built on wealth and military reputation, found both foundations crumbling simultaneously. Strategic reality was even worse. Charles had lost not just an army, but the core of his military power. 20,000 men could not be replaced quickly, not with the quality and training that made them effective. The artillery captured at Morat represented years of investment. The supplies, the equipment, the logistics train, all gone. Burgundy still had territory, still had wealth, but it no longer had the military means to defend either effectively. France, watching from the west, began to move. King Louis XI, Charles's lifelong rival, saw the opportunity immediately. Burgundian territories that had been untouchable when backed by 20,000 soldiers suddenly looked vulnerable. French diplomats appeared in border cities, making offers, suggesting alliances, quietly preparing for the dismemberment of the Burgundian state. The Holy Roman Empire, watching from the east, made similar calculations. Habsburg princes who had grudgingly respected Charles's power now saw weakness. Ancient territorial claims that had been suppressed by Burgundian military might suddenly seem worth pursuing. The vultures were circling, and Charles knew it. He tried to rebuild, sent messengers to every corner of his territories demanding fresh troops, borrowed more money at ruinous interest rates, hired every mercenary captain who would still accept Burgundian coin. By autumn of 1476, he had assembled another army, not as large as before, not as well equipped, but an army nonetheless. Charles told himself it was enough, told himself that Morat had been a fluke, a combination of bad weather and bad luck and subordinates who had failed him. He did not, could not, admit the deeper truth, that his entire approach to warfare had been proven obsolete by men who fought with weapons their grandfathers had used, that numbers and artillery and cavalry meant nothing against an enemy who understood terrain and timing and the psychology of shock. In December, Charles marched north toward Nancy, another city he intended to besiege, another chance to prove that Burgundy was still a power to be feared. His commanders advised against it. His troops were tired, poorly supplied, winter was setting in. But Charles needed a victory, needed to prove that Morat was an aberration, needed to silence the whispers that he was finished. He besieged Nancy in a snowstorm with an army that was already half-beaten in spirit. And when a relief force arrived, smaller than his own, but better led, better motivated, Charles rode out to meet them in battle one final time. It was January 5th, 1477, barely 6 months after Morat. The battle lasted 2 hours. Charles fought personally, desperately, trying to rally troops who no longer believed in him. He was surrounded, unhorsed, struck down in the melee. His body would not be found for 3 days, frozen in a pond, half-eaten by wolves, stripped of anything valuable. The greatest duke in Europe, the man who had dreamed of empire, died alone in the mud and ice, abandoned even by his own soldiers. Burgundy died with him. The state fragmented immediately. France seized the western territories. The Habsburgs claimed the eastern lands through marriage. The dream of a Burgundian kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean evaporated as if it had never existed. All because 1,200 Swiss soldiers had emerged from a forest on a rainy morning and destroyed an army in less than an hour. Charles the Bold had wanted to be remembered forever. He got his wish, just not the way he imagined. Within weeks of Morat, every royal court in Europe knew the details. 1,200 against 20,000. Less than 1 hour. Total annihilation. The numbers seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. Burgundy, the most powerful military force in Europe, had been erased by Swiss militia. And suddenly, every king, every prince, every city-state that could afford them wanted Swiss soldiers. The mercenary market transformed overnight. Swiss pike companies, already respected, became the most sought-after military commodity in Europe. Italian city-states sent recruiters into Swiss valleys with chests of gold, begging for troops. French kings negotiated contracts for entire regiments. German princes competed to hire Swiss guards. The Pope himself established the Swiss Guard to protect the Vatican, a tradition that continues 500 years later. The Swiss reputation became mythic. They did not break. They did not retreat. They did not negotiate once battle was joined. Stories spread and grew in the telling. Swiss soldiers marching through cannon fire without flinching. Swiss pike formations destroying cavalry charges 10 times their size. Swiss discipline holding against impossible odds. Some stories were true. Others were exaggerated. But all of them served the same purpose. If you wanted soldiers who would absolutely, certainly win the battle, you hired Swiss. The Swiss Confederation understood the value of this reputation and guarded it carefully. They did not hire out to just anyone. Contracts were negotiated at the canton level, approved by councils, bound by strict terms. Swiss soldiers would not fight other Swiss soldiers. That was absolute. They would not break contracts or switch sides mid-campaign. Their word, once given, was iron. This reliability made them even more valuable. You paid more for Swiss troops, but you knew exactly what you were getting. The military impact rippled across Europe. Other armies began copying Swiss tactics. Pike formations became standard. Drill and discipline became priorities. The age of armored cavalry, dominating battlefields, was ending, killed not by technology, but by organized infantry who refused to run. Morat proved that a well-trained militia could defeat professional soldiers. That terrain and timing mattered more than numbers. That morale and cohesion could overcome artillery and armor. Swiss mercenaries fought in Italy, in France, in the German states, in conflicts from the Alps to the North Sea. They earned fortunes for their cantons and glory for their families. Young Swiss men who might have spent their lives farming could now make careers as professional soldiers, commanding respect and high wages. The Swiss economy, never wealthy by European standards, suddenly had a lucrative export: military expertise. But here is what most people get wrong about the Swiss. The myth became that they were unbeatable, that Swiss soldiers were somehow superhuman, that their pike formations were invincible, that hiring Swiss troops guaranteed victory. The reality was more complex and more interesting. The Swiss were not unbeatable. They lost battles. They suffered defeats. Later, at Marignano in 1515, Swiss pike columns would charge straight into concentrated artillery and be slaughtered, proving that even the best infantry could be overcome by superior firepower and defensive positions. At Bicocca in 1522, they would charge entrenched positions and be massacred, demonstrating that courage without tactics was just suicide. What made the Swiss dangerous was not invincibility, but something subtler. They forced you to fight their kind of battle. They dictated terms. They chose when to engage. They understood their strengths: discipline, formation integrity, shock assault, and refused to fight in situations where those strengths did not matter. When they won, it was because they had created conditions where their advantages were overwhelming. When they lost, it was usually because political pressure or overconfidence had forced them into battles they should have avoided. Morat was not proof that Swiss soldiers were unstoppable. It was proof that Swiss soldiers, when used correctly, under ideal conditions, with proper leadership and favorable terrain, could achieve results that seemed impossible. That lesson, that victory, comes from creating the right conditions, not from inherent superiority, was the real legacy of the battle. But Europe did not want subtle lessons. Europe wanted heroes and myths and stories of invincible warriors. So the Swiss became legend, and for the next century, that legend would be worth its weight in gold. So why did the Swiss win at Morat? The easy answer, the one that gets repeated in history books, is discipline. Swiss discipline versus Burgundian complacency. Swiss pike formations versus disorganized enemies. But that answer, while true, is incomplete. Morat was not won by a single factor, but by the convergence of multiple advantages, all exploited ruthlessly by commanders who understood exactly what they were doing. Start with timing. The Swiss did not simply march to Morat and attack. They timed their assault for dawn, when visibility was lowest, when soldiers were least alert, when the transition from sleep to combat readiness was most difficult. They marched through the night to achieve surprise, sacrificing rest for the element of shock. This was not luck. This was calculated. The Swiss commanders knew that an army caught unprepared was an army already half beaten. Then the weather. The rain was not just an inconvenience, it was a weapon. It soaked Burgundian gunpowder, rendering artillery useless. It reduced visibility, allowing the Swiss to approach undetected. It turned the ground to mud, hampering cavalry and making rapid repositioning impossible. The Swiss, accustomed to fighting in alpine weather, marched through conditions that paralyzed their enemies. They did not just endure the storm, they used it. Terrain was equally critical. The Swiss approached from high ground through forests, using paths they knew intimately. They descended onto the Burgundian camp from an unexpected direction, hitting defences that faced the wrong way. The Burgundians had prepared for a battle on open ground, where their numbers and artillery would dominate. The Swiss gave them a battle in close quarters, in mud, in chaos, where pike formations excelled and cavalry could not maneuver. Leadership matters, but not the way people think. The Swiss did not win because they had military geniuses. They won because their command structure was based on trust and initiative. Officers knew their men. Men trusted their officers. Decisions could be made quickly without elaborate chains of command. When the situation changed, Swiss units adapted. Burgundian command, by contrast, was centralized around Charles. And when Charles was not present at the point of attack, his subordinates froze, waiting for orders that came too late. Morale is often cited, but morale alone does not win battles. What mattered was the specific kind of morale the Swiss possessed. They fought for their homes. Every Swiss soldier at Morat knew that defeat meant Burgundian armies would march into their valleys, that their families would suffer, that their independence would end. This was not abstract loyalty to a distant king. This was existential. You do not retreat when your home is at stake. You do not surrender when your family's survival depends on victory. But perhaps the most important factor was one that is rarely discussed: Burgundian overconfidence. Charles and his commanders expected the Swiss to approach cautiously, to negotiate, to be intimidated by superior numbers. They expected a conventional battle where they could leverage their advantages. Instead, they got a dawn assault through a storm by an enemy who had already decided that caution was the greater risk. The psychological impact of that surprise, the sudden realization that you are under attack, unprepared, in conditions that favor the enemy, was devastating. The numbers themselves tell an incomplete story. 1,200 Swiss did not defeat 20,000 Burgundians in direct combat. They defeated perhaps 5,000 who were actually engaged before panic spread. Once the Burgundian line broke, once soldiers began fleeing, the numerical advantage reversed. A running enemy is not an army. It is a target. The Swiss did not need to be stronger than 20,000. They needed to be stronger than the fraction they actually faced, and then let panic do the rest. This is the real genius of Morat. The Swiss created a situation where every advantage was on their side, and every Burgundian strength was neutralized. Artillery useless, cavalry immobilized, numbers irrelevant, because the enemy could not bring them to bear. It was not just discipline that won. It was the orchestration of multiple factors into a single overwhelming advantage that lasted just long enough to break enemy cohesion. Could the Burgundians have won? Absolutely. If scouts had detected the Swiss approach, if the camp had been properly organized for defense, if Charles had positioned reserves correctly, if the weather had been clear, if. War is contingent. Small changes cascade into different outcomes. The Swiss won because they controlled as many variables as possible and forced the enemy to fight in the one situation where Swiss advantages were decisive. That lesson, that victory comes from creating conditions, not from inherent superiority, is why Morat matters. It was not a miracle. It was a masterclass in exploiting every advantage and denying the enemy every strength. And the cost of that mastery is written in blood across the fields of Morat. The field after the storm was silent in a way that living spaces should never be silent. no birds, no wind. Just the quiet that comes when too many people have died too quickly in too small a space. Swiss soldiers walked through the aftermath, faces blank, processing what they had done. This was victory. This was what winning looked like when you absolutely, completely destroyed an enemy. It looked like hell. Bodies lay everywhere, stacked where defensive positions had held briefly, scattered where the rout had begun, sprawled in marshes where men had drowned trying to escape. The mud was so saturated with blood that it had turned black in places, a dark soup that squelched under boots and clung to everything it touched. The smell, copper and shit and death, would not wash off for days, would not leave the survivors' memories for years. Eyewitnesses who recorded the aftermath struggled to find words adequate to the scene. A Swiss soldier from Bern wrote home, "We walked through a field of the dead for an hour before reaching the far edge. God forgive us for what we did, but they came to destroy our homes." A Burgundian survivor, captured and later ransomed, described it differently. It was as if God himself had judged our duke and found him wanting. The Swiss were his instrument. The dead were not all soldiers. Camp followers had been caught in the rout, cooks, servants, women who travelled with armies, children who had nowhere else to go. War does not discriminate. When an army collapses, everyone in its path dies. Swiss halberdiers had killed without asking questions, without checking faces. Enemy was enemy. The sorting out of who deserved to die and who was merely unlucky came only after, in the guilt that followed. Bodies were piled for mass graves. Swiss soldiers worked alongside Morat townsfolk, hauling corpses out of the mud, trying to sort Burgundian from Swiss, trying to give their own dead individual burials while the enemy received anonymous pits. It took days. Some bodies could not be moved, too deep in marshes, too tangled in collapsed tents, too decomposed already in the summer heat that returned after the rain stopped. Mothers and wives came looking for their dead. Swiss women searching for sons and husbands who had marched away and not returned. Burgundian women who had travelled behind the army, hoping to find loved ones alive, finding only bodies or nothing at all. The victors allowed them through. Even in triumph, even after such complete destruction, the Swiss understood grief. They helped where they could, pointed to where certain units had fallen, sometimes just stood beside a weeping woman in silent witness. The emotional weight of victory settled slowly. Initial elation, we won, we survived, Morat is saved, gave way to something heavier. Swiss soldiers who had killed for the first time processed what that meant. Officers who had given orders that led to thousands of deaths carried that burden home. The Confederation had won its independence, had secured its borders, had proven its military prowess, but the cost was measured in nightmares and memories that would not fade. Morat's defenders, who had held the walls for 10 days, walked through the field and could not believe what they saw. This was the army that had bombarded them relentlessly, that had seemed infinite and unstoppable. Now, it was just corpses and abandoned equipment. Victory felt unreal. One garrison soldier wrote, "We prayed for deliverance, and God sent it. But I do not think I will ever pray for such deliverance again, knowing what it looks like." The lake itself became a graveyard. Bodies washed ashore for weeks. Fishermen refused to work those waters. The stench drove families from lakeside homes. Eventually, time and nature reclaimed the dead, but the lake would carry the memory. Locals called it the blood shore for generations afterward. This is what total victory costs. Not just the enemy's dead, but the weight of having killed them. Not just survival, but the knowledge of what survival required. The Swiss won at Morat, but they did not walk away unchanged. They carried that field with them forever, in songs, in stories, in the quiet moments when veterans stared at nothing and remembered what it felt like to kill a man, and another, until killing became routine, and the real horror was how easy it had been. Europe's map was about to change. Burgundy would collapse. France would expand. The Swiss would become legendary. But none of that abstraction meant anything to the men and women who stood in the field after the storm and tried to make sense of what had happened. Victory is never clean. It is always written in blood, and someone always has to wash it away. Morat mattered, not just for Switzerland, not just for Burgundy, for all of Europe, for the next 5 centuries of politics and warfare and the shape of nations that still exist today. 1 hour on a rainy morning in 1476 changed the trajectory of history, and most people have no idea it happened. Start with Burgundy. Before Morat, the Burgundian state was the 3rd great power in Europe, rival to France and the Holy Roman Empire, wealthy enough to dictate terms, strong enough to carve out a kingdom. After Morat, Burgundy ceased to exist as an independent entity. Charles's death at Nancy 7 months later simply formalized what Morat had already accomplished. The western territories went to France. The eastern lands went to the Habsburgs through marriage. The dream of a Burgundian kingdom died in the mud outside a small Swiss town. France benefited enormously. King Louis XI, who had spent decades maneuvering against Charles, suddenly found himself inheriting Burgundian territories without having fought for them. The Swiss had done his work for him. French power expanded westward and northward. The foundation for France's later dominance in European politics was laid partly by what happened at Morat. The Swiss had inadvertently created the conditions for France to become the preeminent continental power. For the Swiss Confederation, Morat was transformative. Before the battle, they were a regional power, respected but not feared. After Morat, they were untouchable. No major European power would seriously attempt to conquer Swiss territory for the next 3 centuries. The independence they had fought for since the 1300s was secured absolutely. They had proven that their military system worked, that their republican government could defend itself against monarchies and empires. The military lessons spread across Europe. Pike formations became standard infantry tactics. Drill and discipline became priorities. The idea that well-trained militia could defeat professional soldiers changed how armies were organized. The Swiss model, citizen soldiers, communal training, formation integrity, influenced military thinking for generations. Even after firearms made pikes obsolete, the underlying principles remained. Discipline, cohesion, and proper training matter more than individual prowess. But there is a darker legacy too. The Swiss became mercenaries, and for the next 2 centuries, Swiss soldiers would fight in almost every major European war, usually on opposing sides. Swiss pike companies faced each other at Marignano. Swiss guards died defending French kings, even as Swiss soldiers fought for France's enemies. The Confederation's policy of allowing cantons to hire out troops individually meant Swiss blood was shed for causes that had nothing to do with Swiss independence. The military prowess proven at Morat became a commodity, bought and sold across Europe. The lesson of Morat, that discipline and terrain and timing can overcome superior numbers, has been relearned in every century since. From the American Revolution to the Viet Cong, from Finnish forces in the Winter War to modern insurgencies, the principle remains. A smaller force that controls the conditions of battle can defeat a larger enemy. Morat did not invent asymmetric warfare, but it provided one of history's most dramatic examples of how overwhelming numerical superiority means nothing if you cannot bring it to bear effectively. Today, Morat is a quiet lakeside town. Tourists visit without knowing what happened there. The fields where thousands died are farms now, peaceful and productive. There is a monument, a small museum, local festivals that commemorate the battle with pageantry and pride. But the visceral reality, the terror and chaos and slaughter, has faded into comfortable history. That is how it always goes. Battles that reshape continents become tourist attractions. Suffering becomes statistics. The dead become numbers in history books. But for 1 hour on June 22nd, 1476, those numbers were living men. Soldiers who believed they were building an empire. Farmers who believed they were defending their homes. All of them caught in a moment that would echo through centuries. Here is what matters. 1,200 men stood against 20,000 and won. Not through miracle, not through luck, through discipline, through unity, through understanding their strengths and exploiting their enemies' weaknesses. They proved that courage and cohesion can defeat wealth and numbers, that fighting for your home gives you strength that mercenaries cannot match, that the small can defeat the mighty if they refuse to accept that the fight is already lost. That lesson is why Morat still matters. Not because we should glorify war or romanticize violence, but because sometimes, rarely, desperately, at terrible cost, the underdog wins, the impossible becomes real, the farmers defeat the empire, and the world changes in an hour. 1,200 against 20,000. Less than 60 minutes. Total victory. That is not just Swiss history. That is human history. The story of what happens when people decide they will not submit, they will not retreat, they will stand and fight regardless of the odds. Sometimes they lose, sometimes they are crushed. But at Morat, for one impossible hour in the rain, they won, and 5 centuries later, Switzerland is still free.